Darwin said, I have dragged along my significant other with me, who is here to enjoy the evening with us. And when I opened the message from Julie that said Merriweather Farms was happening and did I want to come and speak, my first thought was, yes, I do. And so I started sort of racking my brain for what kind of story would be good on a beautiful sunny afternoon. And then I'm reading the flyer and I was like, oh, and poetry. Oh, can I do both? How can I do both? And then I thought, there's a story behind every poem when you take it apart and when you break it down. And so I thought I would talk about how old we are when we're brave enough to finally admit we like poetry. In fact, we love it. And there's poetry all around us, and there's poetry in most of us as well, if you look for it. And so for me, that bravery didn't come until I was in my mid-30s. I wasn't ready for poetry before that. I didn't get it. Didn't make sense to me. And so then I went to college, and I had this whole plan. I was going to be an English teacher, and in my free time, I was going to write novels, because that's what I wanted to be, a novelist. I'm going to write novels. I'm going to be the new Danielle Steele. Anyone? Yeah, classic, trashy, zany romance novels. That's what I was in for. Money. And I went to college, and there isn't time to write novels when you're in college either, especially if you're raising, 3 kids on your own, and it got to be kind of a struggle. But at Southwest State, that's where I found poetry. My first class in poetry was with Adrian Lewis. If you've met him, you know that he is a large man in both stature and in art, and I learned so much from him. And then Bill Holm, silent message to Bill. That was my first poetry moment, was with Bill, was I had reworked a poem that he told me maybe needed some work, and he was writing, and I read my poem, and his head popped up, and I thought, okay, that's a poetry moment. I want more of those. And so then it became a matter of how do I get involved with poetry? How do I legitimize these things that I'm writing down on a piece of paper and then shoving away in a drawer, or the 17 notebooks I have in a trunk that nobody knows about? Honey, don't look. Don't find it. Okay. And so I took those things with me, the things that I'd learned from them, how to listen to different voices, how to hear if there's a translation. Did it carry? Do you know enough about what's going on to be able to understand these poems? Some of the political poems that we're writing now, and we are, we need the background to understand what they're all about. And once I understood that you needed the who, what, why, when, and how of what was going on in the geopolitical and socioeconomic world that the poets were responding to and raging against, poetry begins to make sense. So halfway between, it was the year before I graduated from Southwest State with this English degree, and I was asked if I wanted to teach a class in poetry, and I said, are you kidding? I've never taught anything. Maybe Sunday school when I was in 9th grade, and it was bad. But of course I always say yes, and so I said, yes, I do want to teach this class. And it was only 6 sessions at the Gold College at Southwest State. It used to be called the Senior College, now it's the Gold College. Well, I was going to have a full house. You look kind of familiar, sir, I'm just going to say. And I was going to have a full house of seniors who, some of them were terrified of poetry, some of them hated poetry, some of them were really excited, and some of them thought they were already great poets. And in everybody's mind, everybody's a great poet, right? And so what we learned was in the beginning half of the class, we would learn about different types of eras of poetry, the beats. The Harlem Renaissance is one of my favorites. We talked about Pablo Neruda, we talked about Emily Dickinson and Lord Byron and where our poetry and our voices come from. And in the second half of our sessions, after we had a little lunch, because that's sometimes the best part, we would write poetry, and so we learned poetic terms and we learned types of poetry. And so they were very brave, these older people who wanted to just sort of try something new. And there were some people in the class who I remember really, really well. I don't remember names, or in other instances, I don't remember the poem, but poetry reveals something about all of us. And I remember this couple named Joe and Lori. And Lori was recovering from a stroke. And so this poetry class for her was a way to start practicing with poetry again, practice with words, putting words in order, how do words work again. It was part of her recovery from her stroke. And her husband, Joe, was there along with her, just absolutely supporting her every step of the way, had no interest in poetry whatsoever, but he had a lot of love for Lori. And he came into the class one day, sort of cornered me on my way in the door, and he said, "I don't like you anymore, I am mad at you." And I said, "Joe, what happened?" And he said, "I woke up at 5:30 this morning trying to rhyme." And I said, "Well, I win, Joe." But it was Lori that we kind of watched, and I'll come back to her in a moment. But there was another gentleman in the class. He was a retired farmer, and we got to our little session on haiku. And if you remember from 8th and 9th grade, tapping out the haiku beats on your tabletop or on your thigh, haiku has to fit. And this gentleman did not think that he was going to write a haiku at all. And I wish, like heaven, I had remembered his name, because he walked in and he said, "I think I wrote a haiku." And I said, "I would like to hear it." And he said, "I saw Janice last week, prettiest girl in our class. Now she's in hospice. And still today, I get the chills, because how did this man who was afraid of poetry take it and make it his bitch overnight?" Because poetry and haiku is now his. Okay? But let's come back to Lori, because Lori was real kind of shy, the whole class, withdrawn. She wasn't she was afraid. She'd had this stroke, and it made her different from who she was, and she didn't have the bravery to get up and stand and be a poet. But on the very last day of our class, Lori said that she wanted to read a poem. And I thought that was great. And Joe said, "Well, honey, hang on, don't you want me to read it for you?" And she said no. And Lori pushed her chair back, and she stood up, and she read her poem to the class. And I cried. And I've never felt such gratitude in my entire life for helping to build that environment where she felt safe, and she felt secure, and she felt like she could kick it, and she did. And that is why I love poetry, because it reveals more about us. It gives us a voice, and sometimes it can even give us our voice back. Thank you. Enjoy your evening.